the US or Russia. And among pledges of further military support came the promise by France to follow the UK in supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine. One potential difficulty was overcome on the eve of the summit when Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan lifted his year-long objection to formerly neutral Sweden joining the alliance. 31 members will soon become 32. NATO expanding because of the war in Ukraine, even as the war exerts pressures that test its unity. Jonah Hull, Al Jazeera, Vilnius.
In sports, Trinidad and Tobago beat Guyana by 6 wickets to earn their first win of the West Indies Rising Stars Under-19 Men's 50-over Championship on Monday.
Guyana bat first and were all out for 146 in 40.1 of their allotted 50 overs. Thaddeus Lovell top scored with 33, Shamar Yearwood scored 29 and Rivaldo Phillips 20. TT Under-19 spinner Andrew Rambaran had best figures of 4 for 27. Ronnie Lester Pereira took 3 for 8. TNT was well on its way, reaching 136 for 4 in 38 overs before the match was delayed by rain. The Duckworth-Lewis method was implemented to determine a result and TT emerged victorious. Kyle Ramdu top scored in the winning effort with 37. Justin Jagasa made 31. Captain Rajiv Ramnath scored 21 and Kyle Kisundath 16.
And that's the news on PBCJ. Thanks so much for watching.
People were laughing. Oh yeah, they knew my problems. They knew my pain. Hallelujah. 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 Jesus help me from sin. Yes. Hallelujah. God is able to do just what He said He will do. I'm not always as happy like every single day. Forgotten, I am not forgotten. 'Cause I loved you before you knew what was love, and I saw it all, so I chose the cross. Move the immovable, break the unbreakable. God, we believe. Father, you know we mean it. There's a heart of stone. We're ready. Jesus said yes, nobody can say no. Nobody can say no.
Jamaica Gospel Star 2023 is off to a fantastic start, and voting lines are now open until 6 p.m. on Saturday, July 15. You can vote as much as you want. Vote using the free Reggae Jamaica app. The 3 finalists with the lowest number of votes will leave the competition. Make sure you vote.
More than half of the region's people cannot get enough proper food. They join millions around the world who are facing a food shortage. Conflict, climate shocks, the remnants of the COVID-19 pandemic, and rising costs are behind the global food insecurity. We in the Caribbean import most of what we eat, so we are feeling the pressures of the crisis. The spiraling food prices in particular are grueling for householders, communities, and countries, and are pushing up the cost of living. Caribbean governments have responded by providing food subsidies for their people, collaborating with the food importers to keep prices down, and encouraging consumption of domestic and regional products. And over the medium to long term, CARICOM has pledged to boost regional food security by providing 25% of what we eat by 2025. Joseph Cox, Assistant Secretary General, Directorate of Economic Integration, Innovation and Development with the CARICOM Secretariat. Mike McLaughlin, founder of the Trees That Feed Foundation, and Regis Chapman, Representative and Country Director with the World Food Programme, Caribbean Multi-Country Office for the English and Dutch-speaking Caribbean, examine why the war, climate shocks, the aftermath of COVID-19, and high costs are fueling this crisis, and explain the Caribbean's response and perspective to this social, economic, and environmental crisis. I'm David Ellis on behalf of our sponsors, the Central Bank of Barbados, welcoming all on television and online to the Caribbean Economic Forum. Addressing food security in the Caribbean is our focus tonight. And I am delighted to host this forum, which, as I said, has been mounted by the Central Bank of Barbados in its effort to educate and engage with the people in Barbados and the region on economic and financial matters that could impact our lives and even reduce our bread and butter. We put a question to members of the public, and this question sought to find out from them the extent to which you've been impacted by food shortages in the region. And basically, what we found was that quite a number of people felt that there was little or no effect on them. A moderate amount, nearly 30%, felt that it was a matter of concern, but very few people said it affected them a great deal. But based upon some work which has been done by the World Food Programme, they have done 2 surveys in the region, one in September of last year and one in May of this year. And Regis Chapman is with us from the World Food Programme to give us a sense of what those 2 surveys said to us about food insecurity in the region. And perhaps you should begin by explaining for us what is meant by food insecurity. Good evening, Regis.
Good evening, David, and thanks for having me tonight. Maybe just to flag, actually, the surveys that the World Food Programme has been doing have been in support of the CARICOM Secretariat, and we've actually done 6 rounds. The first round started just after the pandemic hit the world and the region started shutting down. The surveys look at food security and livelihoods, and when we talk about food insecurity, what we're essentially saying is that people are struggling to put a nutritious meal on their table 3 times a day, every day. People are struggling to basically feed their families in the way that they had before. So as you mentioned in your opening, we're now estimating that around 3.7 million people in the English-speaking Caribbean, about 52% of the population, are facing some degree of food insecurity. Now, of that, it's about 9% that are severely food insecure, and the rest are moderately food insecure. So there's obviously a difference between those 2, just as there would be a difference between food secure and food insecure. Obviously, the population that is severely food insecure is extremely alarming. But what we've been seeing over the last several rounds is how the situation has changed. Back in 2020, in April, when we did the first round of these surveys, again, as I mentioned, the Caribbean was largely shutting down, and what we saw that food insecurity was driven largely by all of the mitigation measures that were being taken to prevent the spread of the disease. So our ability to just go shopping was a major factor in those days. That's changed significantly. Now it's an issue of affordability, and what we see in these last two rounds is really the increasing proportion of people that are citing the lack of financial means as a key driver to their food insecurity. We've seen over the last two rounds that around 97% of people have flagged that food prices had increased over the period just before the survey. Not a surprise. I think we all see it as we go to the grocery store or we go to our fruit stands or wherever it might be. Prices have been going up, and people are feeling that. I think what we're also seeing is that, to make ends meet, around 3/4 of respondents are using their savings. And while 58% are reducing expenditures on health and education. So those people that are able to stay food secure or even just be moderately food insecure are doing so at expense at their future. So they're not spending on health and education. There's impacts on their livelihoods. And the concern that we have is that if that affordability issue isn't resolved soon, some of these decisions that households are taking will have much longer repercussions. If I may just very quickly, there are a couple of points on, for what we're here to talk about today, agriculture. Respondents that are involved in agriculture continue to report the high cost of inputs. So fertilizers, animal feed, all sorts of agricultural inputs, those costs are also high, as is the cost of fuel. And fisher folk are seeing the same. The cost of fuel is a major factor impacting their ability to conduct their livelihoods. And then finally, your average consumer is just eating smaller quantities. 57% of people said that they're eating smaller quantities than they had before, or they're buying cheaper or less preferred foods, which is around 62% of the respondents reported that. And these are the highest figures we've seen since the first round of the survey. So just a few quick points from that last round of the survey to sort of set the stage.
Well, thank you. Let me come now to Joseph Cox, who is with the CARICOM Secretariat. From where you sit, Joseph, how do you see the magnitude of the problem?
No, well, the truth be spoken is that the survey results did point to a reduction in the quantum of persons that are food insecure. However, the reality of life is that what you're looking at is, as Regis quite rightly pointed out, you're looking at situations whereby the food inflation is such that it is putting a lot of people under pressure. So, for example, in Suriname, April to April, meaning April 2022 to April 2023, inflation was running at 66%. You have other circumstances. I believe in Trinidad, we're looking at 17%, Belize 14.7%. You have other countries, Guyana slightly lower at 6.9 and Barbados at 4.3. But then you see the truth, when you look at it, you see countries like Dominica for 2022, their inflation was 7.5%. So the point is simply this, that what has happened is that the dynamic has changed. So you have geopolitical challenges, which coming out of the war or the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, that has created its own problems now in terms of helping pushing up the price of oil. There are other shortages that have been brought to bear, because no matter what, even though the goal, of course, is to reduce our food imports by 25%, the reality of life is that we also have to treat with some of the items that we do not grow in the region and which are still part of the staple diet. And therefore, you have some of the inputs that have gone up, fertilizers, yes, and a lot of those challenges are coming out of those straight supply chain challenges, which started with the pandemic, but seemingly have been a little sticky. Then you have other issues which have been brought to bear. So the point I'm making is that what we are seeing is that whereas the level of or the quantum of food insecurity, you would say um, from the base on the basis of the data, that it has reduced somewhat. The fact of life is that given the inflationary impulses that have been impacting the region and the people, you will find that we'll have not just food security challenges, but we'll have nutritional security challenges. Because remember, even though a pound of food stuff is not the same, it depends on the actual food that you're consuming. So you will find that people will opt in some respects to the cheaper stuff, which might not be the best thing for them, and that can have some downstream challenges.
So we identify inflation as a major factor in the post-COVID period. But you have a situation here where even if you put more of an emphasis on producing more of your own food, those input costs will also influence the prices. That brings me now to you, McLaughlin. How do you see us tackling these various problems? Because it's not just one, it's several.
First comment is that, I'll thank the Central Bank of Barbados for putting something, a conference like this together, because this is evidence, at least, that there is growing awareness of the problem and the need to do something in an organized way, not just talking, but to do something in an organized way about increased food security. There's many problems that have been listed that have contributed to worsening food security, including conflict, pandemic, inflation, and so on. What we did one time is look at a map of the world to see where was hunger and malnutrition. Hunger and malnutrition, sadly, is concentrated around the tropical regions. Ironically, these are the regions that have year-round growing seasons, and so agriculture ought to be working in these tropical areas. In fact, we've also looked at a couple of statistics about the kinds of foods that are being eaten. And so if you add wheat, corn, rice, and soy, you have 80% or more of all the food consumed in the world. So everything else, meat, fish, every other kind of fruit, vegetable, makes up 20%. Those crops don't grow in the tropical regions, or at least not as well. So one of the challenges has been how to substitute locally for the foods that are being imported from the developed countries. And without diving too much into a personal situation, I'm co-founder of Trees That Feed Foundation. We spotted this issue. I mean, several people have spotted this issue, but 15 years ago we got started and we said what we need to do to help to address climate change, to help to address food security, to help to address local economic activity is to plant trees, but not just any trees, fruit trees. And so we started in Jamaica, which is where I'm from. We started with a breadfruit tree, which is well known. We didn't want to try to change people's behavior to introduce some unfamiliar food, which would take many years, if not a generation, to become accepted. Breadfruit is one of those foods. It's an underutilized food. It's kind of taken for granted. There's kind of a tree in your grandma's backyard, and when it's bearing breadfruit season, there's kind of more fruit than you can even eat. So most of it wastes, and you roast one or two on a Sunday. But people have failed to realize what an incredibly valuable food source this is. So one of the things that we're doing, and we're doing this with Barbados, with Trinidad and Tobago, with the Bahamas, with a number of other countries, also Central America and Africa. It's talking to the governments, talking to entrepreneurs, talking to farmers, and to individuals to say, you should appreciate this wonderful food, breadfruit. And so we can talk much more about this, but one quick statistic I'll leave you with. We performed a study, we got a grant, we did a study, we looked at the yield of breadfruit trees. And the average breadfruit tree, looked at 50 trees in Jamaica, produced an average of 154 fruit, weighing an average of 4 pounds. Some trees more, some less, some fruit larger, some smaller, but that was the average. And so each tree is producing 600 pounds of food, assuming you can reap it all. Now, I granted that there's typically some waste, but an acre of breadfruit trees would produce, if my math is correct, 20,000 pounds of food product. An acre of wheat produces about 7,000 pounds of food product. Breadfruit would be a more prolific food source than wheat. Why can't we do more in an organized fashion to cultivate breadfruit at every level, at the individual homeowner, at the farmer, at the co-op, at the commercial level? This is something that we're pushing. I'll pause there for a moment, but there's huge advantages to developing breadfruit for its nutrition and its ease of growing in the climates that we have in the Caribbean, other fruit trees as well. We've heard of many forestry efforts in many of the islands, which are planting trees to help with climate issues, but in many cases they're planting timber trees, sometimes even decorative trees. Well, we think fruit trees are the answer, and we have some statistics I'll share a little bit later on as to the tremendous investment return that you can get from planting breadfruit and other fruit trees. Hope that's answering the question.
You answered the question well, but one of the difficulties with it is that what has been the track record of the region in trying to deal with a project of this nature? There is almost nothing new under the sun in this region. What are the difficulties that others have reported in dealing with breadfruit and with fruit tree production in the region? Because there's got to be some track record there associated with projects of this nature. What are they telling you?
There's less there, of course, than we would like to have seen. What I think has happened is that the urgency of the situation has not been as clear in the past as it is today. I mean, it's very clear from changing rainfall patterns, storms, floods, droughts, extreme temperatures. It's becoming clear to all but a very few skeptics that things are changing, something needs to be done. It's happening now. As I mentioned a little bit ago, several governments are starting to take organized action. What we have seen in the 4 countries I mentioned, plus others, is a willingness for the governments to cooperate with private enterprises in a public-private partnership. And I actually think that that's going to be the magic that's going to help to solve a lot of these problems. The governments typically have resources. The private enterprises have the entrepreneurial spirit and perhaps the financial acumen that is actually necessary for this to work. There has to be somebody making a profit. Otherwise, you're looking for subsidies forevermore, which won't work. Now, I would say I see more effort with going into public-private partnerships, more awareness, the beginnings of some changing behavior to accept more local foods instead of all the imported fancy foods, ultra-processed foods.
So let me get a comment here from Joseph Cox. This whole issue of trying to get greater private sector involvement, because as Mike has just said, there is that profit motive, and if there's no money in it, there's no private sector interest.
Yeah, true. No, that's absolutely true. But the thing is simply is that what we have found as we move forward with the 25 by 25 initiative is that the private sector is not only a willing partner, but they recognize the opportunities that do exist. And therefore, and I mean, the profit motive obviously is very strong. And they're frankly speaking, there, to use a cliche, there is gold in those hills. Because the fact of life is that a lot of the products, a lot of the areas that we're looking at, you see, one of the things that we have made a mistake in this region is that we have been focusing, by and large, over the last so many decades on primary production, primary produce. But the fact of life is that there is also a lot of money to be made out of processing some of these items. So let Mike raise the issue about breadfruit. I absolutely agree with him. Absolutely. But the challenge that I'm seeing, and one of the things that we are doing, and in fact, we're going to be doing it, and when I say we, through the Caribbean Week of Agriculture coming up in October, that will be held in the Bahamas. One of the things that we've been doing is basically seeking to reintroduce our young people to what I call the indigenous or the local foods. Too many of us nowadays, to be truthful, we were more identified because of cultural penetration through the television and cable and so on. We can identify with a lot of the North American fare, etc., etc. But we do not recognize what we can do with a lot of the stuff that we have, that we grow locally or regionally, as the case may be. Breadfruit can be in chips, breadfruit can be salad, they have breadfruit wine. A lot of work has been done in these things. So in other words, there's considerable opportunity that is there that can be brought to bear. We have seen similar experiences with cassava, where if you notice, cassava has been brought in to enhance production of beer in some markets, etc. But David and colleagues here on the call, one of the areas that we need to, of course, bring in when we look at this, and that's why I'm so appreciative of the point that Mike just made, is the whole issue of Prairie del Lasney. Because with the best will in the world, that has been a big challenge that we have had, and we have to treat with it. And David, I'll give you a simple statistic. In Jamaica, over the last 10 years, they have accounted for, they have raised or indicated that they have experienced $6 billion in losses to Prairie del Lasney. And in the year of 2022, the police and the agricultural wardens and so on effected nearly 4,000 raids. That is how pervasive the problem is. So, I mean, while we're looking at these things, and there are considerable opportunities, and I absolutely welcome the idea of planting the fruit trees and so on, because there's a lot of potential there for it. We have to, one, reintroduce persons to what you can do with the foods that we do have, modern presentations, etc., etc. Because let's be clear, 60% of our regional population is under the age of 40. All right, so you have to basically reintroduce people to what it is, because frankly, people in my generation, when we drop out of the scene, I have a feeling that a lot of the food stuff that we were accustomed to, that we would have no challenges in embracing, may well go with us. And that's therefore, it is imperative that we start to reintroduce people to these things. But we also have to look at the issue of the Prairie del Lasney, have to look at the supply inputs and some of the creative ways that we can bring things to market.
Regis Chapman, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to circle back a little bit to some of the earlier comments as well around nutrition, because I think this is a very important point that Joseph touched on. The Caribbean has the highest cost of a healthy diet anywhere in the world. Actually, today was the launch of the 2023 report of the state of food insecurity in the world. This is a report done by FAO, WFP, IFAD, WHO, and UNICEF. And so we've seen a 5% increase globally. Well, actually, sorry, 5% increase between 2020 and 2021 in the cost of a healthy diet in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Oceania. but only marginally in North America and Europe. And so again, we're seeing this increase. This increase is affecting, countries where you see higher levels of food insecurity, and where some of these challenges that Mike also touched around on agricultural production occurring. And I think the other aspect of this is around inflation, and we mentioned, the high levels of inflation, but I think also the unique challenge that SIDS, that island nations have, is that inflationary trends tend to take longer to come down than it would be at the global level. So we see a lot of data on global food prices. Well, those decreases, when there are decreases, don't necessarily hit SIDS at the same level that they would at larger markets. The transport cost is a big issue here. And I think I'd like to flag, in addition to the perennial larceny, the issue around transportation is another major challenge here. But going back to that point on affordability, and I think this is key. So the 25 by 25 is critical. There's obviously need to change some of those diets. And I think, I like to say getting back to our roots. And I mean that with all pun intended. Looking at our root crops, our tubers, going to the breadfruit and some of those more traditional or traditional crops that we eat in the Caribbean. And how do we get consumers back to, prioritizing and prioritizing those types of commodities in exchange for the expensive imports. And that will have certainly an impact. As we talked about before, the cost of agricultural inputs are still going up. But nonetheless, you end up with a fresher, healthier food at the end of the day, right? We lose a lot of the nutritional value in some of the basic fruits and vegetables that are imported in the Caribbean that could be grown if we address some of these challenges around perennial larceny and transportation and storage and handling. I think there's a lot to unpack here. Certainly we need to look at how we do change those diets again. And as Joseph said, this large percentage of populations under 40, but I think we also need to look at how we use schools and getting kids back away, shifting away from perhaps some of the wheat-based products and the processed products to locally produced foods and create that value in those commodities, whether it's as is, off the tree or processed, as Joseph mentioned.
You talk about perennial larceny, but in Barbados, there's another problem: monkeys. Are we alone in that regard? Is that Joseph Cox?
I think Barbados has quite a unique one, but Joseph, I'll let you chime in.
I don't know. I suspect it is quite unique to Barbados. I know of other issues that people have, but the monkey, because the other day being in Barbados and seeing them in full flight, I had no appreciation of it, but until I saw it for myself, and it is a challenge. There's no question about it. But I don't remember seeing it like that anywhere else.
I don't think there's too many monkeys other places. Trinidad has a few, but I just like to point out that the monkeys really like sweet fruits like mangoes. So it's very hard to get a mango off a tree in Barbados. But the monkeys don't like breadfruit. And they don't like root crops. And so there are some possibilities of planting crops that are not attractive to the monkeys.
Okay.
One more quick point on breadfruit is that we've talked about the costs of the input costs on certain other types of crops. And breadfruit is actually not dependent on fertilizer. Fertilizer actually is good because it increases the yield. But it's a cost benefit. Situation. With our study, we found that organic fertilizer could almost double the yield of a breadfruit tree in terms of.
We'll come back more on that shortly, and we'll also hear shortly from two of our interveners as we continue this discussion on food security in the Caribbean.
CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you.
experts help to find common solutions for common problems during this COVID situation. We fighting to protect our livelihood across the nation. This is for we to learn, share ideas and concerns, to live life like we deserve. We must change we mindset first. Build strong economies, closer societies. We all have a duty. CEF is for me and you. Beyond COVID, CEF is for me and you. Caribbean Economic Forum.
Polymer banknotes can last.
There is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and public policy interests. The tobacco industry, for profit, produces and promotes a product that has been scientifically proven to be highly addictive and causes millions of deaths per year. This is in conflict with the intent of public policies, particularly those related to safeguarding the health and well-being of citizens. In keeping with Jamaica's treaty obligations, the proposed Tobacco Control Act makes provision for the strict regulation of the interaction between public officials and the tobacco industry. Strong tobacco control policies, such as the provisions in the proposed act, will safeguard public health policies and give the next generation a chance to live and breathe easily.
Whenever you hear the following tone, the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, ODPEM, will be giving information on an emergency situation affecting the island. Please be on the alert and listen to your radio and television for further information. This was a test of the Emergency Alert System, brought to you by ODPEM.
Jamaica's new banknotes are now in circulation. But can customers still use old banknotes? The old banknotes will be phased out over time, but can still be used to carry out your everyday transactions. Bank of Jamaica encourages Jamaicans to exchange old banknotes for new notes at commercial banks across the island.
So far, we have touched on some of the challenges of trying to meet that objective of slashing our regional food import bill by 25% by 2025. We looked at the cost of imported food, the cost of inputs, predial larceny, and in the case of Barbados, the monkey problem. Guyana's President Irfan Ali said in June that between 2019 and 2021, hunger in the Caribbean was at 18.4%. And he said it was a level of insecurity, of food insecurity that was higher than the global average. And he then went on to say that regional distributors do not want to disrupt their business arrangement and find it easier to import to give an assessment of the extent to which the traditional way of doing business in the private sector in the Caribbean and the relationship, let's say, with North America, Miami, and places like that, and even further afield, Thailand and Malaysia, and those places have also come into the picture now. The whole distribution network that businesses have developed and depended upon, to what extent is that an issue that needs to be addressed?
Well, I think it needs to be addressed, and I think, to be truthful, as perverse as it may sound, I think the pandemic has started to address it, because what that created, if you all recall, is we had severe disruptions in terms of the supply chains. So therefore, some of the issues, some of the materials, some of the stuff that would have been previously imported, the persons no longer had access to, and therefore substitutes had to be brought to bear. And frankly, what will have to happen in this respect is that I said to you, and I maintain this, we have to step up the production chain, because it can no longer be that we are just looking at developing and producing primary products. We have to carry it up and start to do some processing, an increased number of companies doing processing, making things in chips, making things in all sorts of products that the market will respond to. What I find the problem is that yes, there is a challenge in terms of taste. Yes, we have some countries whereby I believe up to 80% of their food is imported. That's a matter of taste. That's a matter of what's available to the market. That requires a strategic pivot in how you treat with these issues. In other words, that's why I keep saying you have to reintroduce the things to the market. That is one side of the coin. Another side of the coin is in terms of the risk-averse nature, the overly risk-averse nature of, for example, our financial community. So, for example, if you look at some of the data right now, you find that a substantial amount of the credit in countries are going to the public sector, and less so, of course, to the private sector, which now creates some longer-term challenges. But the fact of life is that, yes, there has to be a strategic pivot. We have to look at reorienting what is it that we put on the table, and frankly speaking, the supply chain and the costs that are associated with it will impact on it. Of course, we also have to be concerned about the fact that we do import. Most of the countries are importers of oil, and therefore our costs of electricity tend to be quite high, and therefore that is a mitigating factor in terms of being able to produce the requisite items at affordable rates for the market. And we have to also ensure that what we have in place are mechanisms that avoid the economic dumping of products in our markets, where, in other words, that's basically selling the item at below the cost of production. Because you have all sorts of unfair practices that are being brought to bear. So the thing is that, yes, I agree with it. There needs to be the strategic pivot. But I wish it were just as simple as us saying, let's encourage everybody to buy local.
Regis Chapman, that's quite a mouthful that he's delivered there just now. Quite a lot of challenges that confront the region as a whole in this regard. And I'm particularly interested in how you see the financial challenge confronting the private sector.
Look, I think, one of the interesting, the fact that we're here talking about this today, I think is quite interesting. If you rewind back to before the pandemic, food security wasn't really on many people's agendas. Obviously, farmers and people that were engaged in agriculture or import-export, were interested in the issue of food supply and some of these supply chain issues. But the pandemic really exposed the fragility of food systems in the Caribbean. And I think what's happened since then is that, through the surveys that the CARICOM Secretariat and WFP have been doing, for example, it's helped to put on the agenda politically a bit more the issue of food security. And over the course of last year, there were a couple of high-level forums, one in Guyana, one in Trinidad, with heads of states. And I think just that, having prime ministers and presidents, discussing issues around food security is a major significant change. Now, if we look at the challenges and if we look at the solutions, I don't think many of these are new. If you actually go back to, pre-pandemic, I forget, and Joseph can probably give me the dates, but the old CARICOM strategy for food security and nutrition, and there was an associated action plan. Not much that was written before the pandemic in that strategy or that action plan has really changed. The the problems existed before are the same that exist now, and some of the solutions that were proposed before are many of the solutions being proposed now. So I think what we're seeing is this shift, and I think part of that shift has been how governments have been approaching and engaging the private sector. So certainly there's an opportunity and a responsibility for the private sector to contribute to some of these solutions. Now, obviously, if the objectives and the interest of a head of state is going to be different from that of a someone running a private company, but we need to look at where those win-win opportunities are. Now, where I see one of the biggest challenges that is yet to be really addressed is the issue around transportation. So the World Food Program globally, we're one of the UN experts for humanitarian logistics. So we do a lot around logistics and transportation in the Caribbean when emergencies strike. So we know a few things around transportation within the Caribbean. I don't know if this is still valid, but during the pandemic, I used to say that it costs more to ship a container from Miami to Barbados than it does from Australia to Miami. Again, just to give you an idea of those costs. But I think more challenging, if we look at it from a food security perspective, is that the transport businesses and networks within the Caribbean are really tailored to a type of business that is less conducive to some of the intra-regional trade that the 25 by 25 initiative is promoting. And so, again, if you have fresh produce out of Guyana, that produce can't be containerized, shipped to Miami, bouncing around 20 ports on the way to get to eventually back down to, let's say, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we need to look at what are some of the transport options and what's needed to facilitate some of this trade amongst countries as well. And I think the private sector has obviously the expertise to bring to the table for those discussions, but we also need to have a willingness to look at changing some of those models. Now, one last point, though, I think is to also flag, if you're, again, private sector, whether you're in transport or whether you're in the tourist industry and you have, a captive audience that you need to feed or whatever the issue might be, there needs to be a degree of stability of that supply as well. So it's one thing to say that, country X can produce, sweet potatoes, but if those, if that production all comes in glut and then during parts of the year there's no production or lettuces or whatever it might be, and these other challenges around transport or prediolarceny or whatever it might be, interrupt that stable supply, then we have challenges. And so how do we make sure, it's a little bit the chicken and the egg, right? How do we make sure that you have a profitable environment for the private sector, but how do you do that in a way that also addresses these food security challenges and addresses the inaffordability of food right now in the Caribbean?
Okay. Joshua Jones is one of our interveners. And tell us what you do for a living, Joshua.
Hi, good evening. I am the founder and CEO of Red Diamond Compost Inc. We are a biotech social enterprise focused on ensuring that persons can have access to clean and nutrient-rich foods.
What's your concern this evening?
Well, this evening, the main concern is, having understood the various issues and factors that are contributing to food insecurity, do we know who are all the necessary actors and what the practical steps are required to actually achieve food security in the Caribbean? And at the same time, whose primary responsibility is it to measure and manage that process so that we are effectively, closing the gaps hindering our success?
What you mean by actors? Can you be a little bit more specific?
Looking at stakeholders from businesses, private sectors, who are the actual institutions, entities, or persons involved or that need to be involved.
Okay. So let's get a response. I suppose we can take that response from you, Joseph Cox.
Okay, let me try, because that's very wide. All right. First of all, in a nutshell, to be a private and a public sector, because everybody this to treat with the challenge that you face means all hands on deck. That's one. Now, if you're talking about specific institutions, For example, at the in the regional space, you have institutions like CARDI, you have CAFSA, um, you have the CPSO, which is a regional private sector organization, and such alike. The point that I would like to make where that is concerned, though, is that in treating with the challenges, and I think Mike raised it earlier, these things have to be by and large based upon public-private partnerships. In terms of the measurement of the outcomes and so on, frankly, that the data challenges are a big issue in the region, but it still remains by and large the responsibility of the state to ensure that the requisite data collection is done and that the effective monitoring and evaluation exercise is executed. What we see is that we see positive signs for the data that we have at hand thus far, which will be pointing to countries by and large. I mean, you have some, more advanced than others, but by and large, moving along that continuum. That is the 25 by 25 initiative. So the thing is simply is that the stakeholders, is everybody, this is a case of all hands on deck. So you're talking about, for the private sector, you're talking about, of course, the financial institutions and the non-traditional financial institutions. You're also talking about, from the financial sector, it's not just for funding. You're talking about insurance, because there's right now, in fact, I believe within the next couple of months, a regional agricultural insurance, two regional agricultural insurance products will be brought to market. And that's before the end of the year. They definitely will be on stream. So you find that sort, it's a holistic type of intervention frame that it's going to be working. So I mean, if you're looking for individual entities or individual things, it will be the political directorate and the public sector, the private sector, and all the derivatives thereof. That will be part and parcel of this game.
Here's another of the interveners. Here's another of the interveners. This is John Jones.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Do you see more programs being introduced to encourage contract farming, some specialty items by local farmers as a solution to food security?
I'll come to you, Mike McGinn.
I'm going to do my best to give an answer to that. There is some contract farming. All the coffee produced in Jamaica, goes to Japan, so there's big contracts there. I would say the way to get started on contract farming is to kind of do some math. Not to lose my audience, but we looked at the economic return of planting fruit trees. We've done the math specifically for breadfruit. You could do this for any crop. We say for $15 US, we can plant one breadfruit. Now that probably sounds expensive, but that includes taking care of it, buying it, delivering it, planting it, care for the first year. Then the next year, you got to spend a few dollars. We said $5 per tree for organic fertilizer, water, care, fencing, keeping away the goats. Then by the third or fourth year, you start to get some fruit. By the fifth or seventh year, you have a full fruiting tree. And we've looked at how much a farmer could sell his produce for. And so 50 cents for a breadfruit, you're going to earn $75 that first year, and then the second year, and then for 10 more years, 20, 50 more years. If you look at the investment return on the money that you have put into a fruit tree, it is a massive return. We just heard an investment. There was a brief commercial break, and you can invest and earn 4.5%. And that's good. That's good for a financial product. If you invested money in fruit trees, you could earn a 60% annual rate of interest return. It is massive. That would be one very good way to get people interested in contract farming. If the farmer knew that over time he could make that much money, then you'd start getting the private sector interested. Then you'd start getting some leadership from the combined public-private sectors to organize a larger volume of production. For contract farming, by the way, there's some criteria. Okay, so if you're going to sell your product, you need to have a relatively large quantity, you need to have consistent quality, you need to have relatively low cost, and you need to have consistency of delivery. Some of the private sector producers that aren't interested in buying locally, that's because they've been disappointed. We have anecdotes. We persuaded one restaurant chain to carry frozen roasted breadfruit, and we nagged them enough. They did it. They put it on the menu. This is a well-known chain in Jamaica. 3 months later, they took it off the menu because the supply had completely dried up. And so that's one of the issues. It actually solves several other problems, but the volume of production is one of the challenges that has to be met before we can really get into contract farming.
Regis Chapman, you want to respond to that
Yeah.
concern?
I do. From the World Food Program perspective, what we look at is really the most vulnerable populations and countries, and how we can support governments to strengthen support and services and provide livelihoods opportunities to these groups. And so one of the concerns that I see when we talk about some of these issues is, there are those macro level objectives that we're trying to get to with the 25 by 25, and those are quite important. But we need to be careful not to undermine the development and the growth of more vulnerable segments of society. Those surveys that we've talked about, what we see consistently round after round is that the poorer segments of society are suffering significantly more than the wealthier segments of society. And what we've seen over the series of rounds of surveys is that the spread between the haves and the have-nots have grown. So those with financial means have been able to, weather the storm, let's say, in a much better way than those without financial means. And so what we're seeing is there's probably a strong likelihood that poverty levels have been increasing over these past, 3 years or so now, as well. And so, we need to make sure that these policies also support smallholder farmers. And I think there's a really good opportunity to link smallholder farmers and farmers like John with not just contract farming as we know it, but also with institutional markets. And I'm going to give a very concrete example. Around the world, school feeding programs are designed to keep kids in school, to provide healthy meals, to help them, better achieve their education outcomes in school. And those programs purchase food, cook food, and provide that to children, particularly in vulnerable communities. Governments around the world, are buying that food and oftentimes in a centralized manner. But there's a growing desire for countries and governments to take on board what we call homegrown school feeding programs. So in other words, how do you link those livelihoods objectives with smallholder farmers with those other objectives that you're trying to get through out of your school feeding program? So are there ways to better capture production from farmers like John and others in other countries around the region and link those with some of these school feeding programs? And I mentioned school feeding programs, but there's many institutional programs where governments purchase food for a set of institutionalized populations. So whether it's a prison or an elderly home or schools, there's many opportunities where I think governments can also play a role to facilitate that link in a way that those dual objectives, they can make some sacrifices on one side while let's say the private sector markets get up and running. And the example that Mike gave, of the restaurants putting breadfruit on a menu only to take it off because the supply wasn't there. So how do we, boost that engagement with smallholder farmers, provide a more if not contract farming, at least a more stable market whereby they can sell their goods at a fair price, and that those sales also have an added benefit. And again, I think school feeding programs in the Caribbean feed hundreds of thousands of kids. So there's really a great opportunity there to create some of those linkages. It requires governments to shift some of their public procurement mechanisms. It requires, there was certainly a little bit of a battle. We've been in discussion with the government of Jamaica on supporting their program, and one of the big challenges is the dietary habits of children. And so shifting those dietary patterns are going to be part of that challenge as well. And you need parents, et cetera, on board. But I think, if we're able to show how such programs can meet those education objectives while also supporting smallholder farmers, all the better.
I've heard a lot of discussion about climate mitigation and climate resilience, about trying to generate funding to support those initiatives in the region. But I'm yet to hear anything of that kind of magnitude associated with agriculture, especially in light of the concerns that are raised about financing. And that financing challenge exists for the small farmer as well as it exists for the big farmer. Am I missing something here? Joseph, you want to take that?
Yeah. Well, put it this way. No, I don't think that you're missing something, because if you'll notice in my last intervention, I raised the issue of, for example, agricultural insurance, regional agricultural insurance that is being brought to bear on the market before the end of the year. We have two products coming out, and the fact of life is that when we are looking at, if we want to really look, and if we're really looking at the issues that confront some of our small farmers, for example, in terms of access to finance, there are some fundamental issues. They are not easy to resolve, but they have to be treated with again and again and again until we get it right. One of them being land titling. Most of our small farmers, frankly, right across this region, they do not have security of tenure. And therefore, when they seek to approach a financial institution for financing, they do not have adequate collateral. So that becomes a challenge for them. We also have, in some markets, and I wish it were more would adopt this, there is something called secure transaction reform, where basically what it is that it allows for non-traditional forms of collateral being used in the process. So basically, persons can use things like farm animals. They can use crops yet to be harvested as part of the security that they put forward. Sorry. This is where we have to start to get creative, but it has to be done in partnership with the financial institutions, for argument's sake, and of course, buttressed by the central banks, who provide basically the operating framework within which these financial institutions operate. So you have to look at how do they treat with that. In other words, if a bank is going to be taking non-traditional forms of collateral, they have to have the requisite regulatory cover that the loans that they would offer under that facility are not treated as unsecured loans, and therefore create a greater regulatory challenge for them. So, sorry. So
we're going to have to stick a pin there. Just stick a pin there. We have to continue the discussion. We'll come back to you shortly. And also when we come back, we are going to hear from our social media moderator.
This week on PBCJ Presents.
We have an issue currently in terms of literacy, children actually reading and comprehending what they are reading. So we want to get back to the basics. We want to say to parents, grandparents in the homes, You know, when you are relaxing from your day's work, have your child read something to you. It could be anything. Books are available. Again, come to the library, register your child so they're able to check out a book or two and take it home and just have them read it to you.
Jamaicans, look on the murder rate. You think that normal? We need to get every illegal gun and save our country.
The proceeding was brought to you by the Office of the Prime Minister.
How many more must die because of reckless drivers? How fast is too fast? Make we take time, no man. Obey the rules of the road. Drive with care.
Jamaica's new banknotes are now in circulation. But can customers still use old banknotes? The old banknotes will be phased out over time, but can still be used to carry out your everyday transactions. Bank of Jamaica encourages Jamaicans to exchange old banknotes for new notes at commercial banks across the island.
Come here. You didn't know that driving instructors have to get certified by the Transport Authority before them can do them thing? Yep, a time for serious business. Under the new Road Traffic Act, only registered driving instructors or institutions are allowed to give driving lessons for a fee. So, make sure you're registered by January 2024 if you want to work as a driving instructor or operate a driving school. Do the right thing. Get certified if you want to teach persons to drive. Let's do all we can to ensure we arrive alive.
As we discuss this issue of food security in Barbados and the rest of the region, good evening, Anki.
Good evening, David. Good evening to the viewers. The principal concern is the way that trade liberalization impinges on food consumption, especially during periods of seasonal food insecurity. For example, the discussions been looking at breadfruit and the uses and the possibilities of producing breadfruit in different ways. As a respondent spoke of, breadfruit during seasonal insecurity, the price skyrockets and so inflates. Hence, the issue here is how much do we know about the food insecurity gap, specifically for the vulnerable group? What is therefore pressing, David, is identifying the vulnerable households and designing policies to ensure that these households can afford food during times of seasonal insecurity. Hence, there's a question for David, Joseph Cox. Joseph Cox, what complementary and compensatory policies might be required to address not only production but consumption issues to ensure that the vulnerable groups are sufficiently targeted?
Let me try. Let me try. What I would say as part of the solution to that is that you have to have targeted intervention frame. You have to have targeted social intervention framework, and that will require you to have proper mechanisms to determine those who are truly vulnerable. Because part of the challenge that you have always had with social programs, you try to do direct intervention like that, is leakage, right? But so that's one. Two, what you treat with it, I think it was either Regis or Mike raised the issue about school feeding programs. That's part of the intervention strategy that should could and should be used, and in fact is used in some of our member states already. There's also the issue of looking at basically changing tastes. You really have to reorient, reintroduce some of the things to the young people for them to get on board. Because what has happened is that for a lot of them, they do not identify with the local foods. They really don't. So it is also a matter of public education. So it's a matter of education, direct targeting. We have, for example, in Jamaica, let me speak about it. I know in Jamaica, they have, for example, their PATH program, which is, I don't remember what the acronym means, but basically what it is an intervention framework that allows for you to directly, directly benefit or directly treat with those who are the most vulnerable in the country. And I think that sort of framework is what we need to emulate throughout the region, because honestly, I don't believe in subsidies, because it's easy to speak about a subsidy, but if you think about it, a subsidy is not a targeted mechanism. A subsidy benefits everybody, from the wealthy to the poorest. So that is not the way we should go, in my opinion. So we have to start to look at the direct targeting of those persons, but that must be informed by the requisite surveys that you know to the best way you can, to identify those who are truly vulnerable, so that the intervention is actually meaningful.
Regis
I hope
Chapman.
that.
Yes. Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's an excellent question. Actually, one of the recommendations that the report has is to look at how we strengthen social protection systems and ensure that the most vulnerable are targeted with a variety of types of assistance. And the World Food Program Caribbean Office, this is actually a core part of the work that we do around the region. We support governments to strengthen those social protection programs. Really interesting. I mean, I highlighted before how food insecurity or food security changed on the political agenda with COVID-19. I think, you know, one of the other things is that every government in the Caribbean used their social protection system as part of their way to respond to the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19. And so WFP works with governments to address a number of issues. So we look at the policy and legislative frameworks. We look at targeting, and so exactly this point, how do we make sure that those most in need of different types of programs according to their objectives are the ones that are selected and benefiting from those programs. Linked to that is issues around data management, and so some of the countries within CARICOM have very manual processes, and it might not be very clear why a certain person was selected for a specific program. But how do we strengthen that so we can also see where there is, you know, where there are households that are benefiting from multiple programs? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That can actually be a really good thing. If you know, I'll give an example. Joseph mentioned the PATH program in Jamaica. The school feeding program in Jamaica also uses the PATH targeting as you know, for their school feeding programs as well. You know, recognizing that there's a sort of a need at the household level, but then also that added benefit at the school. So looking at where programs have complementarity and the role of data management systems. We also look at issues around coordination. So how social protection ministries coordinate with other ministries. And for us at WFP, we look at how they coordinate with disaster management authorities, but we're also trying to create more and more linkages between the social protection sector and the agricultural sector, recognizing that, you know, there are sort of segments of society that kind of fall between perhaps benefiting from some of the agricultural programs that might be out there and benefiting from some of the social assistance programs that might be targeting poorer households. And you know, oftentimes what we see in the Caribbean is that the, you know, for public assistance type programs, that, you know, essentially the numbers of people that are entered in those programs are capped by budgetary realities. There's limited fiscal space due to the high level of debt in the Caribbean, and governments have many priorities. We would like to see greater levels of social assistance, but the reality is that at some point you have to draw the line in the sand and say this is the number of people that we can support. And so one of the other
in
things
all,
that we look at is financing as well, and how governments can finance, particularly in times of crisis. So whether it's a seasonal issue or a response after a climatic event or whatever it might be, how governments can finance social protection responses. So social protection is really a key part of this discussion, particularly as we look at the affordability side of this for many of our average consumers.
Could I jump in
but
with
I
an
have
additional
a chance to represent the views of people out there who have heard all of this discussion, and for them it is not new. Someone earlier talked about the food and nutrition strategy for the Caribbean community. We know about CARDI. We've been through a lot of this discussion already, and yet we have seen a lack of the kind of progress that was required. The question they will ask is, what makes this moment so different? Why should we really believe that all of this talk is going to produce results, especially when they listen to the long list of concerns and hindrances that stand before us, whether it's transportation, finance, um, pretty larceny, the list that we have already embarked upon here this evening. What do you think about it, Joseph?
Who? Me?
Yeah, to speak to the skeptics who say to you,
No, sorry, I didn't realize. Okay, no,
yeah,
well, listen. The simple answer I would provide for this is you don't have to. You don't have to. I mean, yes, challenges there are, right? But let us be very clear. The data is pointing to a changing reality. The data is pointing to the market responding. The data is pointing to the reality that people are seeing, that we have to respond to this now. So when you are looking at countries from Dominica, Barbados, and Kitts, Jamaica, if you see the market response, you realize that the 25 by 25 initiative, let's be very clear. Yes, there are quantitative targets that are associated with that, but let us understand that this is production along a continuum. You go, the hands of time will not be reversed. So what we are seeing is that there are changes. There are changes in how we approach agriculture. There are changes in terms of the use of precision agriculture, bringing in the technology in the mix. We're looking at we're looking at virtual extension services being provided in conjunction with the regular extension services. So in other words, there's a greater thrust in terms of education that is being brought to bear. We're talking about looking at treating with some of the traditional barriers to the market using the SPS standards. We're reviewing all of those things. Those things are on stream. This is happening. This is real. This is not, you see, yes, sometimes we sit down and we say, yes, these are the challenges. And for honesty in a discussion, we have to look at the challenges. Similarly, you can't have a discussion about agriculture in the region and not speak to climate issues, because we are, by and large, affected by all sorts of inclement weather. And that's a reality. However, the truth is, when we're looking at how the sector has been reoriented, the quantum of investment that is going in there, the energy, the political goodwill that has been employed, and the energy that is being brought to bear by the adoption of technology, the identification of lands, new techniques. We're looking at hydroponics. We're not just looking at the traditional farming strategies. You're looking at hydroponics. You're looking at, as I said, the use of precision agriculture and so on. The data is pointing to the fact that we are on track for 25 by 25. And not only that, the fact of life is that it's not just a target, but we are moving along a path. and
And
that baffles.
who is doing what towards the goal of 25 by
When they
2025?
say who is doing what, specifically what you
Because
mean?
you often hear about Barbados, Guyana, a little bit of
Right,
Suriname. But when you
Barbados,
look
Guyana. In fact,
across the region, who's
to
doing
be
what?
truthful, most of the countries, I mean, what we are looking at, and when I say most, you have countries in different stages of development, as we can appreciate. So you have some that are more responsive than others. But when I look, for example, at some of the data, for the first quarter of the year, you're looking at some countries 21% of their achievement of their target for the year already. Um, you're talking about some that have exceeded that. So I mean, over 70% of their target. Whereas you have some who are down to probably 10% of their target. So it's a mixed bag. But the truth of it is that we are in 2023. The target is 2025. And they are moving because if you extrapolate, I mean, and it's dangerous to extrapolate on a linear basis when you deal with agriculture. But if you look at somewhere like, for example, Barbados, since you hear Barbados, if you say Barbados is 21% of the target thus far reported for the first quarter, if you multiply that by 4, you're talking about 84%. You understand? In other words, and not to say that you hold me and say, oh, this is definitely what is going to happen, because you have variations. It can exceed it. It can be falling a little below that. But the truth be spoken is that what I'm saying is that the market is responding to the initiative. This is not something once the production is going up or once the investment is being put in the field, you don't have to worry that it's going to suddenly dry up and everything will go back to what it was in 2017 or 2016. So it's moving along a continuum. That's the point I'm making.
Rita Chapman, how do you see the involvement of others?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe to your first question, the answer is necessity. Why this is different this time around. It's simply a necessity, and I think COVID-19 really showed that. I mean, I live in Barbados, David. I'm sure you can attest to this as well. Go into any of your supermarkets and tell me how long your fresh produce lasts these days. It's the supply chain challenges, the prices, etc. So again, I'll leave all the data to Joseph, but there's a lot that is in motion right now. It's a huge challenge, and it's a huge challenge because you can't just pick off one of these issues, resolve it, and then everything's solved, right? Or that it makes a huge difference in and of itself. Transport. If you bring in fast ferries and suddenly you have a service that can move produce around the region quicker and keep it fresh. Well, if we don't address issues at ports, and if we don't address the phytosanitary processes, etc., for importing these goods, and we don't address larceny, and we don't address some of these other challenges, well, that in and of itself isn't enough. So it's I think we need a little bit of patience. There is a lot in motion right now, and I think it will take time for it all to kind of come together and click and link. But as Joseph said, it's not the 23 by 23 strategy, right? It's 25 by 25. So I think we need to be a little bit patient and let some of these things take hold, because they aren't overnight solutions, right? It's not just, well, let's grow more and that solves our problem. It's a lot more complicated than that. So I do think we do need to give it some time. Again, the political will, that you see is significant. There are countries in the Caribbean community that are actively soliciting investment, agricultural investment, and so yeah, things are moving. As Joseph said, some of that data is quite promising. Each country is at a different stage, and I think that necessity perhaps varies in different countries. It's not all things equal, but there has been progress, and I think we'll continue to see progress as this moves forward. Actors like the United Nations, of which the World Food Program is a part of, are looking at ways in which we can contribute to these efforts. From the WFP perspective, we're really interested in how we can help make food systems more resilient. We haven't really talked much about climate change and the climate crisis. Joseph talked a little bit about the two agricultural insurance policy or products that are coming out. This is a huge game changer. There are significant risks within the region that that make these issues a challenge. But I think this is where, if we look at disaster management, perhaps the agricultural sector can take a bit of lessons from the disaster management sector. We work a lot with SEDIMA, and it's very clear within the disaster management community that everyone sort of believes and really believes that not a single country can be ready for a category 3, 4, 5 hurricane all on their own. They require that engagement and that support from their neighbors, and this is where CARICOM comes into play, and it's in the CARICOM entities. And I think agriculture is the same. We need to look at who can do what and how the different countries can contribute to support each other.
And of course, after we've been able to boost food production in the region, we have to be able to move the food around. Now, I saw a study done by the FAO on the establishment of a maritime service to improve agri-food trade and food security between Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Grenada, and Barbados. And one of the things that struck me was that they said that there was an assumption that they would have been able to find 2 public vessels, which I interpreted to be the foundation for this cargo service. I believe they might have been talking about the fast ferry service, but no vessels were found. And it therefore raises the question of, how are we going to tackle that aspect of the issue? Where are we now? And the degree to which that discovery sets us back in trying to move food around the region. Who wants to deal with that? Mike, you want to handle that?
I was starting to think you forgot me. I can't find you any boats in the Leeward Islands. I would like to go back to something a little more basic, if I may. We talked a little bit about vulnerable communities. I'm going to leave the strategy to you, fine gentlemen, and the data and the statistics. I would like to just tell a brief story that's much more at the vulnerable level. We do a lot of work in Haiti. We've planted over 100,000 breadfruit trees. We've helped approximately 20 entrepreneurs to set up nurseries, food processing factories. They bake a regional delicacy called a comparette. Think of it as a biscuit. And one of these biscuits is pretty substantial. It's a whole meal for a school child. And so we do school feeding programs in Haiti because it helps to keep the processors in business, and the processors help to keep the farmers in business. And what we've done in addition with these comparettes, we've created a women's empowerment program. Haiti may be the poorest country in the world. Their average person lives on less than $2 a day. We have the vulnerable in Haiti that are earning less than that. We started a program to give away to women vendors. We have them in groups of 25 to 30. They have a mentor, a local mentor that leads. And what we do is we give them 50 biscuits the first week and 50 more the second week. We do that for a month. So they get 200 comparettes, and we say, go sell them. Some sell them on the street corners, some sell them out of their house, some wander the streets and sell. And so we kept track, talk about data here, we kept track of how many comparettes. We trained them to say, all right, you sell these, but don't spend all the money, because we're not going to give you comparettes forever. It's only for a month. So save some of your money. You come back and you buy more comparettes to sell. So this is not a micro loan. It's micro capital in the form of a food product. And so these ladies, a lot of them in the rural parts of Haiti, we're not in the cities. There are too many crime and gang problems in the cities, but we're in rural areas. And so we kept track, and these ladies did come back after the first 4 weeks, and they bought more comparettes, and they came back again and they bought more. And so many of these ladies have taken their income from $1 or $2 a day to $10 to $15 a day. Instead of buying 200 comparettes a month, they're buying $5,000 a month. You would be amazed at the benefits of a little economic activity in a community. So now the producers are producing more product, the farmers are producing more food.
Time is getting away from us. And therefore I must ask you to finally tell me very quickly how you see the future of this thrust towards trying to produce greater food security in the region. In 30 seconds from each of you. You, Mike.
We're starting at the bottom. We're working with farmers, individual bakeries, producers. We think that the example that we set there will spread throughout the region. We think it is essential for public and private partnerships to show the leadership, starting with strategy and also starting at the grassroots level, helping those most in need.
Thank you very much. Regis Chapman, your 30 seconds.
Yeah, 30 seconds. That's a tough one. So look, I would say that there's, from the WFP perspective, we look at food security from more than just the agricultural production side. And I think that's an extremely important part of it. We need to boost that production, but we also need to address some of those underlying vulnerabilities. So again, the links between, in the Caribbean in particular, the links between social protection and the agricultural sector is really key moving forward. We need to involve, as Mike said, from the smallholder farmers up, but also from vulnerable populations that aren't engaged in agricultural up. And I think the bottom part is as I mentioned before, CARICOM working together as one. As a united group of countries, they can achieve so much more.
Thank you very much. And Joseph Cox.
All right. Quickly, the region has, or the agricultural sector in the region is at an inflection point, and happily to report, the private and the public sector have responded. The markets have responded. The people are seeing the benefits. This is not conceptual frame. This is actual production that's happening. Some of the social intervention programs are on stream, and therefore I'm quite optimistic about the future of treating with the issue of food security within the region.
Well, thank you all very much. We have heard this evening that yes, the region has a level of food insecurity that is higher than the global average, but there is this objective of slashing the food import bill by 25% by 2025. In the process, though, we do have some issues. The cost of imported food has gone up. The cost of inputs has gone up. Pre-deal larceny has been identified as a problem for many. Transportation is an issue. Financing. The traditional sourcing of food from outside the region. All of this still needs to be tackled if we are to get to the objectives that we've set ourselves. I want to thank you on behalf of the Central Bank of Barbados and their outreach and education program for this edition of the Caribbean Economic Forum. I'm David Ellis. You have a good night.
Let us resolve our family disputes peacefully. A family is a circle of love, support, and strength. Violence has no place.
The proceeding was brought to you by the Office of the Prime Minister.
Dancing is more than a movement. It's a form of expression woven within the angles of hips and the curve of a joint and the flick of a fingertip. It's a language universally understood to symbolize happiness, sorrow, grief, and raw emotions. Honed and crafted, it is a reflection of life itself. With the National Dance Theatre Company of Jamaica being an integral part of the island's cultural history, we want to bring you through a part of its journey. PBCJ presents to you footage from the earlier years of the world-renowned company. This is In Times Past.
From the moment human beings appeared on Earth, they have danced to release their emotions and communicate them to others. And the urge to respond physically to an emotion seems to be common to all people and all ages. For example, at one time or